They will tell you the Iron Bank of Bravos is a vault with a voice, that it keeps the world's coins in neat little stacks and occasionally clears its throat to remind kings that numbers have memories. But the vault is not the story. The story is a set of contracts and currents that run under cities and seas, a lattice of obligations so dense that a whisper in Bravos can become a war drum in the Reach. If gold is the blood of commerce, the Iron Bank manufactures arteries. Its hidden mechanisms are not bolts and bars. They are time, risk, enforcement, and the very human terror of being cut off from all three. Begin with the simplest claim. The Iron Bank does not sell money. It rents certainty. Coin is a prop in that theater. The thing that makes a crown bow and a commoner bend is not the glint of minted faces, but the promise that a demand will be met at a future date, in a different port under different skies. The bank's business is to make that promise real. It does so by writing the world down and making the world obey the writing. For every chest you imagine on a barge, there are a dozen lines in a ledger binding harvest tithes, customs tariffs, mine outputs, and ship hulls yet to be laid. Those lines travel faster than ships and weigh more than iron. That is the game. Follow the path of a coin and you will be lost in taverns and toll gates. Follow the path of a promise and you will find the instruments that matter. There are letters of credit that bloom like passports wherever the bank seal is recognized. A cloth merchant in Gulltown can turn a letter into unassailable purchasing power at a counting house in Norvos. There are bills of exchange that cancel each other across the narrow sea, clearing debts without a single coin crossing a quay. There are storage receipts for grain, silk, and saltfish. There are warehouse warrants that let a quartermaster in mere pledge cargo he has not yet unloaded. There is marine insurance that prices the weather and the reach of pirates, and there are forward contracts, quiet wagers on the price of wheat next winter or pig iron in spring, that bind barn and forge to the bank's clockwork. Each instrument is a way of crystallizing uncertainty into something that can be traded, tallied, and seized. Collateral is where the mask slips. What do kings and houses actually pledge? Hard things, yes, gold ornaments, gemmed crowns, silvered plate. But the hard things are trifles beside soft things that cut more cleanly. The right to levy port duties for 7 years, the first claim on or from a reopened mine, a slice of land's tithe before the sept takes its due, the charter to a bridge whose tolls catch every wagon. A house's heirloom sword may sleep in a Bravosi vault to guarantee a dowry. A library of old vellum deeds can secure a loan to hire a sellsword company. A fleet's figureheads can be hawked to ensure its survival. I have seen covenants that pledge hostages as living bonds, bringing sons and daughters across the sea to be raised among strangers whose kindness is indexed to timely payments. I have seen a debt repaid with a family's right to judge its small folk. Justice itself turned into currency at 3% per season. To grasp the bank's network, look at the dockside slights. A spice ship unloads in Old Town. The captain carries a letter bearing the Bravosi mark. The factor at the quay verifies the sign and marks his ledger. The captain is paid in local coin drawn against the account of a money changer in Bravos. The cargo is sold by agents who have already pledged it forward to the kitchens of nobles and the galley pots of garrisons. The liquidity comes from trust in the letter, not from any chest in the hold. Behind the letter lies a network of clearinghouses in Bravos and beyond, each tallying net positions of dozens of houses and hundreds of merchants. Netting makes the bank's reach sublime. Liabilities evaporate in columns long before coin would ever cross. And in the gaps between those columns, opportunity. The bank extends credit where it sees virtue, constricts it where it smells rot, and shapes the season's winners in a script no king can erase. Risk is the hinge on which this entire contraption swings. The Iron Bank prices risk with a fanatic's devotion. There is the winter premium on grain financiers who refuse to wait for thaw. There is the war surcharge for cities that wake soldiers who cost money even before they cut a throat. There is the sea's stubborn levy, a different rate for summer squalls and autumn storms. Covenants lace these rates with discipline. The borrower must keep his tariffs at least this rich, must not pledge the same duty twice, must let Bravosi auditors tally the sacks in silos and the ingots in warehouses, must not take on new debt without the bank's blessing, must hire only captains with no more than 2 losses to their name. Cross-default clauses, subtle and lethal, make late payment on one obligation a breach of all. Collective enforcement clauses oblige allied creditors in other cities to close their doors, shut their letter books, and treat the violator as a dead man walking. The most merciful clauses are not the lowest rates. They are the ones that allow a borrower to confess weakness early and be shepherded into restructuring with a face-saving pledge rather than a gallows. Legal leverage is the muscle that powers the bank's handshakes. In Bravos, contracts are sacred like oaths in a sept, and the Iron Bank's charters are codified in what is called the Standard Charter of Assurance, a template accepted in law courts from the disputed lands to White Harbor. The Standard Charter carries an extraterritorial bite. By swearing to it, a borrower consents to have his assets seized in any port whose rulers have signed the Bravosi treaties, and those treaties are thick on the coasts. The bank maintains its own licensed bailiffs, polite men with accurate inventories who attend a default with ledgers, and writs that make even proud lords step aside. A clause I have seen again and again. A sovereign or house acknowledges Bravosi jurisdiction for all disputes. Not only does the bank write the world down, it insists that the world step into its courtroom. Religion lends the bank a pulpit it does not own but borrows when convenient. The faith of the Seven proclaims that vows bind even kings. The Iron Bank funds repairs to septs and endows the quiet libraries where the faith's canon lawyers teach the sanctity of oaths. At harvest time, when tithes are counted, there are contracts stipulating that 1/10 of 1/10 flows first to a Bravosi agent until a debt is clear. The septons frown, then nod, then preach prudence. The Red God's zealots speak less of contracts than destiny, but money is happy to ride any fire that can keep the dark at bay. When Stannis Baratheon burned for a crown, the bank's emissaries did not flinch from rooms where smoke smelled like a sacrament. Even the faceless god of the House of Black and White, patrons of death rather than debt, influences behavior through fear. Whether or not there is traffic between that temple and the counting houses, many behave as if there were. The possibility of divine cover for earthly enforcement is a pressure that lingers like incense. Covert leverage is the iron the bank does not show. Counting houses breed information. Every letter of credit, every bill of lading, every insurance policy is a map of plans before men trumpet them. The bank knows a campaign's direction before messengers change horses, because it has insured the ships and advanced the pay. It knows when a house hides a famine behind denial because grain receipts stop crossing desks. It knows who is sleeping with whom because the courtesans of Bravos write their own ledgers and the bank's clerks tally discreet arrears. Whispers are a currency, too. The bank lends them cheaply to sell dearer loans later. As for darker methods, nothing is written, everything is guessed. In Bravos, the idea that a debtor in chronic defiance might find his health compromised by untraceable hands persists because it is useful that it persists. The bank never says the word assassins. It does not need to. It has accountants. Consider a case where the mechanisms creaked loud enough to be heard across kingdoms. The Crown of the Seven had always been a voracious borrower. Robert's feasts, tourneys, and gifts taught every arbalest maker and wine dealer to fatten his prices because the king paid late and the king paid more. Interest, mild at first, compounded as wars began to bloom like an orchard of iron. Then a queen pretended the sea would forgive her if she looked away, and a payment to Bravos did not arrive. The emissary sent by the bank was calm. Interest would reset, covenants would thicken, and if remedies failed, the bank would choose a candidate who kept books better than he kept feasts. That candidate wore a stag's head and a frown that never thawed. Suddenly, ships that had been neutral found reasons to sell him sails on credit. Sellswords who had been undecided took oaths with the knowledge their coin would not bounce. Letters of exchange that had refused the queen's seal opened for the king's stern brother. It was not personal. It was arithmetic. When the war flipped again and gold from a great southern house covered the arrears and more, the bank switched its gaze back to the city with the Iron Throne and offered terms that clothed vengeance in velvet. Financing for mercenary companies who could bring a kind of peace a widow could bear. Behind the banners and the emptied goblets, the money trail was crisp. Gold seized from a wealthy reach of croplands was marched as a convoy north and east under the creak of wagons whose axles were insured to the last spoke. Before the convoy even reached a coast, the bank had credited accounts in Bravos to make its arrival irrelevant. The spectacle of chests matters to courtiers, not clerks. With the crown's accounts amended, The bank loosened credit to the Queen's ministers on the condition of specific purchases. Contracts with a storied mercenary company across the sea, retainer for captains whose lineage did not matter so long as their signatures matched past policies without loss. The mercenaries disembarked where they were told, crossed where no one expected, turned to battle. The bank's profit was not only interest, it was the equity it acquired in customs houses that had been pledged as side collateral in the refinancing. For a decade to come, every ship that cleared those quays paid a tiny tithe to Braavos, a quiet current that no speech interrupted. Look at a second case where no banners were raised but bellies were. In a winter that bit early, grain stores disappointed kings and cobblers in equal measure. Prices rose as swiftly as crows, and panic is a market like any other. The Iron Bank had seen the signs in the receipts from inland granaries and the insurance claims from river barges slogging through early ice. Months earlier, it had financed vaults in Tyrosh and Braavos that stood empty then and very valuable later. It quietly bought forward contracts from frustrated farmers at modest prices, giving them certainty for planting in exchange for delivery later. It financed ships to wait in harbor with holds ready, legs of a spider that only needed the right tremor. When famine loomed, the bank dribbled supply in controlled amounts, selling dearer than it had bought, making a margin on the spread between terror and relief. In some ports, the bank linked purchase to politics. A sept repaired here, a local official replaced there. A port's tariff pledged for the next year to a Braavosi agent with a trimmed beard and calm handwriting. The public story was salvation. The private story was basis risk transformed into profit. The grain trade hides one of the bank's cleverest levers, because storage is time made brick. A guardian of S. ILOs can create price by delaying or advancing release. The bank financed cooperages to make staves and rope walks to bind them, not because it loved barrels but because barrels turned harvests into an instrument. The storage receipts became tradable. They could be pledged for loans, cashed against letters of credit in other cities, composited into bundles that paid a yield index to the appetite of a capital's kitchens. Even the loss was priced. Rats and rot were written as allowable percentages. Meanwhile, the small folk paid 3 times. Once at the granary for the inflated sack, once in the tithe the sept collected, a sliver of which sluiced east to clear a noble's overdue obligations, and again in the tax that a crown levied to buy grain from ships kept waiting until the price was right. The bank did not cause the winter. It mastered its tempo. Consider a quieter, crueler case. In a mountain valley where tall pines leaned like parishioners, a lesser house with an older name and thinner purse sought to improve its standing. They had no gold mines, no royal cousins, only timber rights and a banner with a fox. The Iron Bank gave them the same smile it gives everyone and extended a loan to restore a rotting bridge on the condition that future tolls and forest rents would flow through a Braavosi agent until the debt was cleared. When blight struck the valley and lumber exports fell, the house sought forbearance. It received a restructuring instead. A longer tenor, a higher rate, and a clause requiring a ward to reside in Braavos as living pledge. When raids from a neighbor thinned the house's holdfast, the bank declined to finance men-at-arms, citing covenant breaches, but it introduced a prospective buyer for a slice of the timber rights, a rival house willing to pay today for what it could cut tomorrow. The bridge tolls flowed east. The ward learned Braavosi manners. The rival enclosed the forest and denied villagers the twigs they had gleaned for generations. In the end, the lesser house lost its woods, its bridge, and its next lord. The bank gained a tidy asset and a story that traveled farther than any writ. Pay what you owe. In each of these cases, the visible levers, letters of credit, loans, insurance, are only part of the machinery. The clauses in the charters set traps whose teeth are far away from the cheese. Cross-default meant that when the mountain house faltered on a forest covenant, a separate insurance contract on its bridge was canceled, making repairs costlier and late, inviting more defaults. Collective action among allied creditors, from Qohor to Lorith, meant that doors closed in unison. There was no place left to shop alone. In the Crown's refinancings, there were options embedded in the terms. If the Queen failed to meet a customs collection target, the bank could convert a piece of short-term credit into a half-interest in a port, turning debt into ownership with the stroke of a quill. The bank's letters to septons that preached vow-keeping to hungry townspeople were leverage, too. Grief and pride were collateral without being named. Hidden under the instruments is a practice the bank rarely admits and always performs: rehypothecation, the rolling and repledging of collateral to raise more credit. A port's future tariff stream promised by a crown could be sliced and sold as notes to Bravosi widows seeking income. A merchant's storage receipts on wine could be bundled into a pool that paid a steady return to a guild of oarmakers. A lord's pledged statue collection could be valued, insured, and then leveraged to finance the very mercenaries who would protect the house that had once gazed upon those statues with pride. Each turn multiplies the bank's reach, and each multiplication adds fragility. When collateral is pledged twice or thrice and the world is kind, no one complains. When ice catches barges, when war cuts roads, when pirates thicken like flies, the same chain that carried prosperity fast becomes a wick. Who benefits from this? In the short and medium terms, many do. Bravosi patricians become richer not only from interest but from being paid in shares of the world's beating hearts. Ports, roads, bridges, customs houses, and granaries that produce fee after fee. Merchants in all the free cities benefit from liquidity that lets them turn cargoes into coin before compass needles settle. They can sail lighter into risk because the bank prices it for them. Sellsword captains benefit because they can count on paymasters whose letters do not bounce even when their employer's pride does. Clerics benefit because endowments are kept in instruments that yield more than candles do, and the bank's patronage builds halls where the law is taught and litigation paid for. Even small folk benefit sometimes because grain will arrive in lean years, because bridges are repaired and roads are patrolled, because the god of commerce is also a god of continuity. The Iron Bank funds kings who don't drink their coffers empty, and if such kings are rare as honest plum sellers, that is not the bank's fault. Who pays is a longer roll call. Taxpayers pay interest on loans they did not approve and often do not understand, their labor mortgaged to finance pageants and campaigns. Tenants pay as rents rise to satisfy covenants that require a lord to extract more from his land than it can comfortably bear. Women who trade on their bodies pay because their ledgers are watched, their debts resold, their autonomy quantified and thus circumscribed. Traders who refuse the bank's terms pay through isolation. Cash only is another name for slow death in a world where letters cross seas faster than sails. Houses that pledge their future to buy a present victory pay later when their heirs inherit covenants with teeth. Even victors pay, because victory purchased on credit is a lien on future rule. The bank is a silent partner in every decision that affects pledged streams. There are wars that go on a season longer because the bank's letters promised wages through winter, and men brave an extra day when coin glitters at the end. There is a claim that the bank is above politics. It isn't. It prefers the politics of predictability, which is the same as preferring a certain kind of ruler, one who will not surprise contracts with voids, who will not invoke some god at the last minute to absolve debts. Where such a ruler cannot be had, the bank settles for the ruler who can be constrained. It uses public ritual to teach private lessons. When a sovereign who has defaulted too often asks for a new loan, the emissary will arrive with deliberate pomp, be seen by courtiers, and leave with deliberate slight if terms are not met. The message travels down the gossip lanes until even wine sellers refuse to extend tab to the palace kitchens. The bank does not need to own whips when it owns rumor. The systemic risks of this architecture are everywhere if you know where to stare. Concentration begins in comfort and ends in collapse. The Iron Bank is the clearinghouse through which a majority of significant trade obligations pass. When a shock arrives, it is not simply one lender among many shocked faces. It is the face. The bank's model depends on predictable flows, customs, tithes, harvests, and convoy schedules. An extended winter blurs all of these, making risk models laughable. A plague can do in 3 weeks what all the pirates in the world could not: stop papers from turning into payment because the clerks who read the papers are dead. A blockade of bravos would be more than a city's siege. It would be a choke on information and settlement. Accounts would not clear, letters would be blunt instruments without a balancing ledger to make them real, and there would be runs on coin in cities that barely know where Bravos sits on a map. Dragons, if they are more than singers' toys, are another kind of systemic risk, because they compress distance and trivialize fortifications. A world built on timing can be broken by creatures that ignore routes. A single dragon choosing to burn a convoy insured by the bank would be an event. 3 dragons turning ports into ash would be a crisis. Religious upheaval threatens the bank's reliance on oath culture. If a new prophet persuades a city that debts sworn to mortal men are chains to be broken in the name of deliverance, then the bank's legal leverage is a letter to the fire. There is also dependency risk. A dozen free cities counting houses coordinate with the Iron Bank. If Braavos sneezes, Tyrosh gets pneumonia. If a tall ship bearing letters and coin founders where the sea runs deepest, there are clauses to distribute the loss, but sometimes clauses are bandages on amputations. The bank knows most of this. Its risk managers spread exposure across instruments and seasons. Their models price disaster with a premium that is communicated by a simple word: no. It does not fund everyone, and it rarely funds all of anyone. It syndicates obligations to allies in other cities, it caps exposure to any single sovereign, and it demands collateral that lives in Braavosi basements more than in distant halls. Keeps a war chest, yes, and it invests in the mundane resilience that prevents crisis from becoming catastrophe. Lighthouses, breakwaters, the guilds that rescue wreckage faster than storms can reclaim it. It keeps goodwill by funding public works that outlast regimes, so that when a crown falls, the people do not burn the counting house because the counting house paid for the amphitheater their children play in. Where threats cannot be priced or dispersed, the bank sometimes removes them. You do not need to believe that Strange Temple on the lagoon takes commissions from clerks 3 canals away to understand that a few deaths in the right rooms each decade keep ledgers safer than a battalion would. Within the counting houses themselves there is a mechanism that deserves attention not because it is criminal, but because it is human. The clerks are not machines. They are schooled in a discipline that prizes accuracy and dispassion, but they are ambitious in quiet ways. Promotions are lodged not only in competence but in the delivery of new clients, new streams, new alliances. Clerks nurture merchants, merchants nurture soldiers, soldiers change kings. Incentives trickle down from interest rates to gifts, from gifts to favors. A Braavosi clerk's brother-in-law is a shipwright in Pentos, and somehow those ships get insured at the best rates. A cousin in the Sea Lord's court murmurs that a treaty is nearer than it appears, and the bank extends credit to a city that trusts its cousin's whisper. Human bias brings the bank into politics even when the bank pretends not to be there. Think again of storage, of time in barrels, and see the mirror in coin. The bank's coin has its own storage problem. It cannot keep all its deposits in metal, not when letters and bills let it multiply credit beyond weight. If too many clients demanded specie at once, the Iron Bank would pay out as required, but it would force liquidations of collateral that would depress prices, widening losses, forcing more liquidations. The system is designed to avoid this through trust. Trust is the invisible asset that the bank guards more than any vault. It is why it never misses a coupon payment on its own obligations, why it punishes defaulting sovereigns with consistency even when doing so costs profit. There are no holidays from trust. It is tempting to paint the bank as a villain because villains have goals that are easier to condemn than to understand. But the truth is less comforting. The Iron Bank is a machine that makes bargains between present need and future burden precise. It has kept ports open when crown incompetence would have closed them. It has lifted villagers out of famine with cargoes that kings forgot to plan for. It has built bridges whose tolls are fair and whose stones outlast wars by centuries. It has also stripped houses of dignity, prolonged conflicts by giving losers another season to lose, and converted civic life into a spreadsheet where everything that matters can be made to matter less or matter more by a rate. If this sounds like rule rather than service, that is because it is both. I have often thought of the messenger who carries a Braavosi letter of credit. He does not need to carry coin. His confidence is its weight. He can walk into any counting house that honors the bank's seal and be handed sums that would sink a skiff. He owes his safety to the bank's promise to punish those who disrespect its paper. He owes his power to the fact that even a stubborn lord must accept that his debts live in books that can be read in a court he does not control. That letter is the world's most portable fortress. Its gatehouse is grammar. Its archers are clerks. When kings fail, the bank survives. That resilience breeds a certain theology, the idea that the Iron Bank is the only true sovereign, because it can make and unmake others. This is nonsense spoken in taverns and truths told in private by men who have been laughed at by coin counters and then lived to rule because they agreed to be managed in exchange for a throne. The bank cannot invent legitimacy, but it can rent it. Cannot create order, but it can fund order when it sees a market in it. It is not a king. It is a king's weather. Blame it for your ship foundering on a lee shore, and you have misunderstood what wind is. In the mountain valley where the bridge no longer belongs to those who built it, a widow counts out coin to cross every week and remembers when there was only a nod to a neighbor who kept the gate. In the capital that keeps changing hands, a baker learns to take letters instead of copper because the bank's letter arrives even when soldiers do not. In Braavos, a child of that lesser house studies in a school her grandfather despised and dreams of a life far from pines. She will become a clerk with neat handwriting and private doubts. The bank, like all gods made by men, feeds on stories like these, and its priests wear ink-stained fingers instead of cassocks. The verdict is exact and cold. The Iron Bank enforces the future in a world addicted to the present. Price is fate. Its hidden mechanisms are instruments that turn promise into property and property into power. Its leverage is legal, religious, and covert. Its hunger is for predictability more than coin. Those who align themselves with it prosper in the manner of tenants who have learned to read their landlord's moods. Those who defy it learn that refusal is not revolution when the roads you need and the bridges you cross and the granaries you buy from have all been pledged in terms you never saw. Against the charge that it plays at kingship, the bank can answer that it keeps the markets that feed armies alive. Against the charge that it fattens on famine, it can answer that empty bellies do not repay loans and therefore must be filled. Its morality is arithmetic inclined toward continuity. There are questions the bank does not answer because it fears the answers. Who audits the Iron Bank's books when the only court it respects is the one it wrote? If a war or a winter tears holes in too many obligations at once, what stands between the bank and a run on the trust that is its true capital? How far does its shadow fall into temples of death that take faces? And do coins ever cross between those altars? Can a world knit by credit choose to be unknit by anger? If dragons return for more than a season, does the bank find a way to price them? Or do dragons teach a ledger the limits of ink? The Iron Bank's clerks, if they are honest, dream of clean entries and quiet days. The rest of us live with the knowledge that the future is already spent and that the bill will come due, in coin, in favors, in the long reach of a signature that outlived a king. Suppose you push deeper into the ledgers and listen not to speeches but to the scratch of quill on vellum. The Iron Bank's day begins before dawn with what the clerks call night loans, coins that sleep nowhere and wake everywhere. A factor in Braavos advances to a factor in Pentos against storage receipts pledged in Mir, to be repaid when a letter clears in Gulltown at sunset. It is a chain of repurchase, collateral leaving one desk only to return dressed in a slightly different clause. These are not loans in the tavern sense. They are drenched in covenants that specify haircuts on the pledged goods, the percentage by which the bank pretends grain is lighter than the scales say, or tin duller than it looks, so that when the world sneezes, the bank keeps its kerchief dry. When winds veer, the haircuts widen. When the war drums stop, they tighten. A mountain lord who pledges or today against the promise of miners tomorrow discovers that every rumor about bandits widens his haircut by 1 grain per ingot. If he protests that the mine is well guarded, the clerk reminds him that numbers respect neither brave men nor tall fences. That is what margin is, the bank's way of making sure that courage never outruns prudence for very long. When prices turn against a borrower, the bank calls for more. The mechanism is simple and cruel. A message arrives on a swift ship or a fast raven that says deliver 2 more carts of oak staves by the next moonrise or your bridge tolls are forfeit until the season turns. Sometimes the borrower can do it. An uncle sells a necklace, a cousin cuts a grove tighter than custom. The Lord's hall goes cold for a winter. Sometimes the borrower cannot, and then the clauses ignite like kindling. Cross default drags other obligations into the fire. The bridge's insurance lapses. A plank cracks, the fines multiply. A cousin's little vineyard, pledged as a courtesy to secure a cousin's honor, becomes the bank's, and the bank sells it to a neighbor who was waiting with a folded purse. Each step is legal, all of it feels like theft, and neither the law nor the feeling is lying. If you ask the clerks about their law, they will say it is not theirs at all, that it belongs to the Standard Charter and the courts that honor it. The Standard Charter is a living thing, amended by practice rather than proclamation. It does not name gods. It names yields and days and ports and penalties. Kings and councils sign it for the same reason sailors not rope. Nothing else holds in rein. It contains a doctrine called perfection, which means that a pledge is not safe until the world knows of it. For perfection, the bank posts notices in counting houses and on quayside boards whose announcements crinkle in sea air. The port duties of White Harbor for the next 5 winters pledged to the Iron Bank. The timber rents of the Green Fork forests pledged. The tolls on the bridge at Emberbrook pledged. A man who tries to pledge the same duty twice finds his second promise laughed at and his first promise enforced with clerks and bailiffs. That is public leverage, legal and loud. There is also a silence that works harder. The bank keeps registries of every pledge in books that only a dozen senior clerks can touch. Those registries settle disputes because, in practice, whoever keeps the best records wins. Religion, at the ledger's edge, is less theology than choreography. The faith of the Seven, with its starry septs and silver censers, insists that vows bind 2 ways, and the bank seeds its endowments where that sermon is strongest. The sept schoolmasters teach arithmetic alongside obedience. The tithe collector learns to read letters of credit as if they were passages of Holy Writ. In Bravos, the Moonsingers sing of freedom from chains, and the Iron Bank would never be seen to name a person as collateral. It does not need to, takes the tax on chains. A Volantine triarch who earns his coin from slave markets must pass the market's gate duties through a Bravosi agent while he repays a war loan. The bank convinces itself this is cleaner than owning a throat. In the Red God's temples, debt is a test of will. If a leader says the flames have chosen him and the bank funds his march, zealots call the money a sign and skeptics call it proof that the bank worships whatever burns hottest. The bank's clerks shrug. They worship predictability, which is the coldest god. Covert leverage lives behind these public vows like a shadow behind a torch. The bank operates a network of informants who never use the word informant. They are dockmasters with long memories, ship's pursers who prefer steady pay to risky cargoes, guild treasurers who count dues with fussy care. There are courtesans whose little books do not leave their rooms. All that leaves is a number the bank converts into risk. A commander's appetite for borrowed pleasure correlates with his appetite for borrowed pay. A man who loves one often loves the other. There are scribes who copy letters in duplicate as a professional courtesy. There are raven keepers who are paid to keep ravens alive in winter and seldom paid not to notice the message tied to a leg. There are even, they say, a few men and women whose faces change. Whether the bank pays them with coin or with absolutions is a rumor with strong legs. The bank denies it all. But ask the man who plotted treason in a warm feast hall and found prices rise against him before his first recruit had bought a sword. Ask the woman who prepared a revolt against a satrap and learned the satrap had already paid down his loan and bought 3 exits. Information is the cheapest collateral on earth because it is never exhausted by being used. The bank's tolerance for ambiguity has a limit called calculation. Consider the triarchs of Volantis. They are monarchs of a city that likes to remember it once ruled more than a river. The bank has a policy that says it will not accept documents that make slaves into collateral. Yet the city's whole budget bleeds the fact of slavery. Its tariffs drip with it, its port dues, its household taxes, its voluntary contributions to public spectacle. When the triarchs come hat in hand for a new canal or a wall repair, the bank angles its terms to price the stain without naming it. It demands fees rather than equity. It takes a claim on the basalt quarry, not the market gate. It insists that repayments be made through distant counting houses where conscience is easier to stomach. In the bank's boardroom, these are called reputational hedges. Outside, they look like a city that hates chains being all too willing to weigh them. If the Iron Bank is a lender of last resort, it is only because it has arranged the world so there are few other resorts. When a war or a winter tightens all throats, the bank performs a ritual called a circuit. It advances to counting houses in other cities on condition that those houses keep their windows open and their stamps warm. It lends to insurers so that ships can still be insured. It lent once to a guild of oarmakers so that ships could still be built. These are not charities. They are fires lit to keep a forest from becoming ash. The bank owns the clearinghouse that nets obligations at season's end. If that house fails, everyone fails. So the bank makes sure it does not. It keeps a private hoard of silvered plate and gold that never leaves the vaults except during a circuit. It keeps a list of families who can be called upon to pledge an heirloom overnight. It keeps a quiet handshake with the city's sea lord for the use of his navy's coin in emergencies. It keeps, above all, customs houses and toll bridges as collateral of choice, because they are rivers of coin rather than lakes. Rivers do not freeze everywhere at once. Now stand with me through a hypothetical week when things go wrong and watch the mechanisms light up in order. Day 1. Pirates thicken in the stepstones under some new banner that has found discipline. Ships with the bank's letters of credit aboard go missing. The bank's insurers calculate loss ratios at noon and widen premia before sunset. The captains who had planned to sail delay one day. Then 2. Port warehouses begin to fill. Day 2. The price of grain at a major northern port jumps because the delayed ships carry barley that 100 bakers had counted on. The bank opens a circuit line to those bakers' guilds, but it prices it as emergency money. Day 3. A crown that lives on customs revenue notices that customs are down and writes to the bank for an advance against tomorrow's taxes. The bank agrees after insisting on a modest lien on a bridge the crown owns and seldom thinks about. Day 4. A merchant house in Mir that had promised to deliver dyed cloth backed by those custom revenues misses a margin call. The bank seizes a warehouse. Clerks turn its content into coin. Day 5. Rumors sprout that the bank's letters of credit are not being honored in a distant port favored by slavers. The rumor is false, but for 2 days it is true in the only way that matters. The port's clerks pretend not to see the seal on the letter because no one has told them they must see it. A Braavosi emissary meets a city official in a quiet room. Whatever is said, letters begin to be honored again. Day 6. A guild of money changers that had borrowed short to lend long begins to wobble. The bank forces a marriage with a sturdier house. The weaker house's master retires with a face-saving title and a smaller office. Day 7. The pirates are driven away by a coalition of crowns that could never agree on anything except that the insurance premiums made them suddenly attentive. The mechanism worked, but everyone is bruised. The bank calculates what it learned and hardens a clause here and softens a clause there, the way a blacksmith listens for notes in a hammer's fall. At the marrow of all this is clearing, settlement by subtraction. A wool merchant in the Riverlands owes a dye-maker in Tyrosh. A Tyroshi sailor owes a Myrish oar-maker. The oar-maker owes the Riverlands merchant's cousin for barrels. In a world without clearinghouses, coin would slosh back and forth at great expense and danger. In a world with the bank's clearinghouse, the obligations are netted so that only the residual flows. The bank earns fees for this arithmetic. It earns something more precious: knowledge. From the netting process it learns which houses are chronically net payers, who is always on the cusp, who has found a new customer in a far city. This is how it detects bubbles. When a city's guild begins to appear as net earner in all connections, either genius or fever is at work. The bank prefers to bet on fever. It tightens credit to that guild just before the rest of the world realizes that demand for its wares cannot be as infinite as talk suggests. Take the Myrish lenses, a story of light and heat. For 2 years a mania ran through courts and counting houses for glass polished so perfectly that you could read a lit wick's fingernail at 20 paces. Artisans in Mir could not meet demand. Apprentices were pressed into service. Sand was quarried with a violence that sent dunes walking. The bank financed some of this with practiced caution. Then the registers showed that every path into Mir ended with coin, and every path out of Mir ended with debt. The bank asked itself whether the world's eyes had become thirstier than the world's stomach. It began to cut letters of credit for lensmakers more slowly. It raised haircuts on the storage receipts of the very sand used in the craft. It quietly sold forward its exposure to a set of Volantine houses that wished to be modern. When the fashion broke and princes discovered that too much clarity exposes wrinkles, the Volantines clutched paper that confessed its own folly, and the bank had already washed its hands. Law and religion can sanctify a seizure, but it is enforcement that closes fingers. The bank has a polite army made of signatures. When a borrower defaults, the bank writes to every other house that is bound by cross-pledge to cut lines of credit at once. It writes to guilds to stop honor letters. It writes to insurers to cancel policies. It writes, sometimes, to a captain whose ships have quietly been pledged and tells him that the hulls he thinks of as his are now the bank's. The captain can drink and shout, but if he sails with a hull that the bank says belongs to it, he will discover that every port where the bank's seal is honored becomes a wall. If he sails to a port that does not honor the seal, he discovers that the cargo has been insured by a rival underwriter who will not pay in a dispute with the bank. This is what it means for contracts to be a machine. They turn pistons together. There is another class of leverage the bank has learned to wield that is neither legal nor secret: culture. It sponsors plays and bravos that praise thrift without ever saying the word. It sponsors prizes for the best essay by a student on the topic of prudence in governance. It pays bards to sing tales of houses that lived within their means and saw their grandchildren prosper. It tells fables in which vows are kept and gamblers fall into canals. When a city changes its mind about what is honorable, it changes its mind about what it borrows for. The bank greases that change with coin that most people mistake for charity. You may wonder how the bank works within a city that prides itself on being no city's puppet. The answer is that the bank is a city. It has rivalries within its own walls, factions that prefer the stability of triarchies, factions that prefer the efficiency of merchant councils, factions that think kings are worth the cost if their names on documents scare lesser men into order. Elections inside the bank's boardrooms are never elections. They are price transactions, votes pledged the way wheat barges are pledged, favors tabulated and matured. A young clerk with a clean record and a bright "I can become a partner if she brings with her 3 merchants who will do business for a decade." An old partner can be quietly retired if his risks have outstripped his returns. The bank calls this internal prudence. Outsiders call it politics. To the extent these internal tides sometimes leak into public acts, say, a loan extended to a city beloved by a rising partner, it is proof that even the most austere institutions are stocked with breathing people who carry grudges and hopes alongside ledgers. It is worth pausing over the difference between a charter and a knife. A charter says what happens if you break it. A knife is what happens if you do. The bank uses knives rarely because its charters, multiplied and woven, are more effective than any blade. But there are moments when words cannot reach faces. In those moments, the bank acts through cutouts. Men with no obvious connection who perform acts whose consequences just happen to regularize an unruly market. A pirate lord's flagship burns at anchor after he threatens to stop honoring letters of credit in a strait that matters. A judge famous for interpreting charters in a manner inconvenient to Bravosi interests chokes on a fish bone and dies. A smuggler who has become dangerously popular with the small folk is found with the wrong seal on his papers and vanishes into a dungeon that does not admit light. The bank publicly mourns disorder. The market privately breathes easier. Perhaps the bank had nothing to do with any of it. It just profits from the air clearing. The convenience is the point. There are voices that say the bank underwrites the wrong present to restrain a worse future. They point to the Night's Watch, a brotherhood guarding a wall men forget at their peril. For years their stores were low and their honor mocked, and then supplies began to arrive with a frequency that surprised even wary men. Some of that was a lord's sudden sense, some was a king's fear, and some was a counting house's decision that the wall's fall would be an unpriceable event. There is no clause that prevents winter from walking south on legs of ice. There are only clauses that say a counting house will do its part to make sure there are torches on the ramparts. You can call this half morality if you like. The bank calls it system preservation. Where the bank is most naked is where it is most sure of itself. Settlements in cash. The bank despises coin except when it loves it. Letters multiply credit. Coin ends arguments. In any week, the bank could find itself obliged to honor a surge of requests for specie from houses that have decided they no longer trust letters. The bank plans for this with caches along trade routes, with agreements with miners to deliver uncoined ingots on demand, with quiet pacts with mints in cities far from home. It also defends against the need for coin by making sure letters never lose face. Dishonored letters are avenged not with swords but with walls of paper that make the dishonor expensive. Yet there is a saying among old clerks that scratches like a rat at the back of a pantry. Coin is the only truth the illiterate can read. A crowd cannot be convinced by an interest rate schedule, can be calmed by a clink. The bank keeps enough clink to show its face to a crowd if a crowd should ever gather at its doors. The bank's discipline produces a particular kind of cruelty that is easier to miss than a raid: the conversion of communal rights into individualized payments. When a bridge is pledged, it is not just a lord's toll that is counted. It is 100 small guarantees brushed aside. The promise that a widow could pass without paying because her husband died on the bridge crew turns into an entry marked non-compliant. The custom that fishermen could stack their nets to dry on the East Pier without charge turns into a schedule of fees with a kindly discount that still stings. The lodge that hosted wakes becomes a rental and the wake becomes rushed. Efficiency adds up to a loss that does not fit in ledgers. The bank is not blind to this. Its agents advise lords to keep a handful of old privileges to blunt resentment, to create the illusion that nothing fundamental has changed. But something fundamental has. The commons has been redescribed in terms that only column hands understand. Sometimes the bank fails. The failure is usually small because the bank designs failures to be small. A cleric in a provincial counting house becomes a thief in miniature, siphoning coin over a decade in amounts that never alarm his superiors. He is discovered by a young clerk with a fresh education and a fondness for reconciling. The bank settles the matter quietly to prevent confidence from going sour, but it punishes in a loud way in the corridor where clerks pass. The thief loses his fingers, not because the bank enjoys pain, but because hands must remember what hands have done. In another case, the bank backs a satrap whose taxes are orderly but whose cruelty becomes a song that cities sing. The satrap falls to a revolt that surprises no one but him, and the bank loses 3 years' worth of advances. It writes the loss, it adjusts its risk appetite for satrapies that sing too loud, and it hires a pair of poets to write ballads about the virtues of measured rule. The institution learned something. The people paid for its lesson. Do not think the bank keeps its secrets solely by fear. Keeps them by boredom. Its ledgers are designed to be uninteresting to anyone not paid to love them. The ink is brown. The script is small. The pages are bound in mismatched leather that smells like nothing. It is a world that bleeds glamour out of itself on purpose, because glamour attracts the wrong eyes. The glamour lives where it can be denied. In the frosted glass of the boardroom where a window looks down on a canal and the late sun makes a gold ladder in the water. In the quiet cuff of an emissary's coat where the stitching is more perfect than it needs to be. In the faint scent of cinnamon on a contract where the clerk who wrote it wanted the borrower to remember the mood of the room where he signed. Persuasion is not all numbers. It is also air. There is a notion that the bank is a conspiracy. That is untidy language. Conspiracies are plots made by men who cannot admit their wants in daylight. The bank is a method, and methods are brazen. If you want to see the method, stand at a customs house on a windy day near winter. Watch a caravan crawl in, the carts covered in oiled cloth. Watch the official check measures of grain with a rod that has been compared to the city's master measure at the year's turning. Watch him tally the duty without looking the merchant in the eye. Watch a junior clerk peel away a sliver of the duty and mark it for the Bravosi agent. Watch the agent stamp the parchment with a seal that impresses a harbor's arm into wax. The merchant frowns at the duty, grumbles less than he might because he knows that the letter of credit in his coat will be honored at the other end. The bank is simply the current in which he swims. He notices it when it is clogged. He forgets it when it is clear. I have walked through rooms where young clerks are taught double entry in the Bravosi manner and heard the ritual question asked on the first day. What is the asset that is not an asset? The correct answer is reputation. The bank spends silver to buy it and sweat to keep it. It never lies about its own papers. It never misses a payment on its own bonds. When it must choose between profit today and certainty tomorrow, it picks certainty to signal to the world that it will always pick certainty. And it cultivates enemies it can afford, so that it can point to them when it needs to remind a prince that defiance makes a man interesting in the wrong way. It lets one house default now and then to show it still can. It forgives small debts with a public bow now and then to show it is humane. This is reputation management as much as any festival or donation to a cause that poets will sing about. Even dragons can be written down if you find the right ink. The bank's actuaries sit with sailors and map the scorch lines from ancient tales against trade routes and ask themselves how hot winds shift. They set aside reserves for a dragon season the way they set aside reserves for a plague. Quietly, steadily, never even hinting to the world that they are planning for the improbable. If a dragon burns 3 caravans and a ship, the bank will pay claims the next morning and adjust premiums by noon. If dragons become a pattern and not a story, the bank will finance contraptions invented by mad Myrish men who swear they can cast nets of iron too hot for dragons to love. The bank will also finance alliances that can distract dragons. The point is not to conquer myth. The point is to price it. Does the bank ever think about mercy? It does in the way millers think about sparing water. Mercy is a resource, rationed for effect. A proud house that has made a good faith effort and been hit by an event that no one could price, pestilence in the herd, a flood that tore fields into soup, will be offered a grace period if the bank sees value in the house beyond its present wounds. A villain who has robbed his tenants to pay tournaments and then begs for relief will be shown the paper that ends his choices and keeps his estate intact for tenants under another name. This is presented as mercy to the tenants. It is also a business decision. The bank creates narratives of mercy because narratives silence anger for a few seasons. Mercy redeems interest in hindsight. Without mercy, the interest would be remembered with sharper teeth. When people say the Iron Bank will have its due, they make it sound as if the due were a fixed quantity. In truth, the due is a negotiated thing. It consists of coin, collateral, concessions, and occasionally contrition. The emissary will hear a confession if it lubricates a signature. A queen has been known to admit that her father's debts were foolish. A triarch has been known to concede that his predecessor's wars were vain. The bank collects such confessions like pearls. They do not yield coin directly, but they yield discipline. A realm that has admitted its own folly is less likely to repeat it loudly. Quiet repetition is better. The bank prefers its disasters muffled. Sometimes I imagine the world refusing. Not one city, not one house, but the world. A convocation of lords and guilds declaring that they will burn their charters and bargain in grain and iron and favor in the raw. That they will feed their people before their creditors. That they will swap oaths with neighbors and make bridges communal and turn counting houses into granaries. Such movements are always born in famine and die in the first good harvest. Men forget quickly how hard it is to move the surplus of one valley to the hunger of another without murder, and how easily murder becomes a habit when there are no neutral clerks to write down obligations and enforce them. The bank counts on that weakness, but it did not invent it. It merely permits the world to function at a level of complexity that would otherwise devolve into a welter of grudges and short swords. Whether that permission is a blessing or a bridle depends on whether you are eating dinner or serving it. No one should pretend that the bank steps outside the Game of Thrones by sheer virtue. It steps outside because it built the chessboard. A crown cannot win without crossing squares the bank owns. A usurper cannot march without paying toll to bridges pledged in seasons of calm by men who did not think of what those bridges might need to bear. A holy man cannot ignite a movement without preaching in a hall whose stones were set by masons paid with a bank's letter. And yet the bank cannot impose a story that the world refuses. It must find the grain of the wood and carve along it. This great talent is not invention but inference. It reads men and cities as if they were ledgers. It does not always get the sum right, but it always has a column on the next page to correct the last. The open questions will not close just because a scribe has listed them. If you want answers, watch the bank's behavior at the edges. If it begins to fund schools for ravenkeepers in cities not its own, it has decided that speed of message is the new coin. If it suddenly endows a college of law in a port famous for scoffing at charters, it has decided to add a new courtroom to its jurisdiction without marching a single guard. If it quietly buys amphory works far from wine country, it is preparing to store not just wine but time. If it sells part of its customs house portfolio and buys rights to wells instead, it is wagering that water will replace grain as the vector of emergency. These are not advertisements. They are sentences in the grammar of a future that wants to speak. Perhaps the last verdict possible is something modest. The Iron Bank is an amplifier. It makes prudence louder and folly shriller. It makes oaths heavier and betrayals more expensive. It makes a short winter livable and a long winter survivable. It does this in exchange for a rent that never ends. Attention. You can ignore a king for a month and still keep your head. You cannot ignore the bank for more than a season and keep your ships afloat. That is not a boast. It is the texture of modern life in a world that decided to swap barter for promises and then built a temple to promises on a shallow sea. So you may despise the bank and dream of a world without it, or you may envy it and dream of building one more like it in your own city, or you may resign yourself to the arithmetic and save what dignity you can. If you want to solve the problem called the Iron Bank, you would have to reweave the institutions the bank knotted. Courts that honor charters more than kings, temples that honk about vows as if they were sacraments, guilds that prefer predictable drudgery to adventurous windfalls, and populations trained from childhood to consider tomorrow when today is sweet. That is a revolution. The bank has seen 1,000 such projects glow and cool. Keeps a shelf in a back room where it places the pamphlets they leave behind. Not to mock, to remember, and yet even amplifiers burn out. The serene counting houses where the blinds clap softly in the off-sea breeze and the candles are clipped exactly at the hour could be thrown open by a storm the bank did not price. Some prophet could convince enough cities that contracts are chains forged by cowards and that courage is to be poor together. Some plague could eat too many clerks' lungs for the ledgers to keep up, and the first collapse column could tilt so many that the building lists. Some dragon could take an interest in arithmetic. There are no instruments to turn that heat into income. There is only humility, which is not an asset the bank has ever managed to book. Until that day, the bank will write and the world will obey the writing. Not because there is magic in the ink, but because there is prudence in the practice. If you want a different verdict, write a different practice and convince enough people to live by it. Convince them that honor can be kept without seals, that bridges can be built without tolls, that grain can move without shares in the warehouse. Convince them that promise and property need not be twins. If you can do that, the Iron Bank will stop being a weather and become a building that can be looted. If you cannot, the bank will remain a sky. It is hard to fight a sky. It does not bleed when you cut it. It does not shout when you curse it. It only hangs there, indifferent, reminding you that weather is not personal and that failing to plan for winter was never a defense against winter. What remains, then, are the questions you can hold in your hand. What part of your life is pledged without your consent to a stream you do not see? Which toll do you pay that was once a nod to a neighbor? Which oath have you outsourced to a clerk because convenience felt like virtue at the moment of signature? Who is the ward in your family sitting in a distant school because a debt required a face to travel? How much of your city's pride is equity owned by someone else's ledger? If you know the answers, you can at least say that ignorance is not one of your collateral. If you do not, then the bank has already been paid in the coin it loves best, your habit of not looking behind the word due.